William Anderson leaned back in his leather chair, the skyline of Manhattan stretching out behind him, lights flickering in the early evening like stars in a man-made galaxy. His office was cold and calculated, much like the man himself had become over the years. The polished marble floors, the sleek black desk, the minimalist decor, all reflected a life built on discipline, determination, and, above all, sacrifice. No one saw the boy he once was, hustling to survive on the streets of Detroit, or the young man who fell desperately in love with someone he had no right to love. That version of William had been buried long ago, hidden under layers of success, money, and status. The world saw him as the ruthless CEO of Anderson Holdings, a financial giant that made its fortune by buying up struggling companies and flipping them for profit. Few could believe that behind that sharp suit and carefully guarded smile was a man who had loved and lost, and who carried a scar deep in his heart. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Anderson?" His assistant, Linda, poked her head in. "Your car is ready. The meeting at Barclay Towers is at 8. William checked his watch. "I'll be down in 5. He stood and stretched, feeling the tension in his back ease slightly. Meetings, mergers, numbers, they were his life now, and he was good at them. But every now and then, in the quiet moments, the ghosts of his past would creep in, reminding him of the things he'd rather forget. As he left the building and stepped into the black town car waiting for him, the city seemed to buzz with its usual energy. People hurried along the streets, taxis honking, neon signs flashing, all reminders that time never stopped, and neither did New York. He liked that. It kept him from lingering too long on thoughts he couldn't afford. The drive to the Barclay Towers was short, and William mentally prepared for the evening ahead. Another deal to secure, another round of negotiations where he would undoubtedly walk away the victor. It was what he did best. He had earned his empire the hard way, and nothing would ever threaten that. But fate had other plans. On the way back from the meeting, as the town car weaved through the crowded streets, something caught William's eye. A young woman, barely visible in the shadows, huddled on the steps of an old church. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her clothes torn and dirty, her face hidden beneath a mass of tangled brown hair. There was something in the way she sat, so still, so resigned, that struck him, made him pause. William wasn't the type to stop for strangers. He didn't believe in charity. Life had taught him that no one helped you unless there was something to gain. But something about her, something in her quiet despair, pulled at a part of him he thought had died long ago. "Pull over," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. The driver hesitated but did as he was told, bringing the car to a stop a few feet from where the woman sat. William stepped out, feeling the crisp autumn air hit his face. As he approached her, the stench of the city hit him. Garbage, exhaust, the unmistakable smell of survival. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. But then she shivered, a small movement, barely noticeable, and something inside him cracked. "What are you doing out here?" His voice came out colder than he intended. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for a second, he couldn't breathe. Her face, young, fragile, and so familiar, triggered something deep within him. A memory, buried for years, flashed in his mind, but before he could grasp it, it was gone. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He knew what it was like to have nothing, to be abandoned, to feel the weight of the world pressing down on you. For a brief moment, he was no longer William Anderson, the powerful CEO. He was that boy again, lost and alone in a world that didn't care whether he lived or died. "Come with me," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The girl blinked, confused, as if no one had ever offered her kindness before. She hesitated, clearly unsure if she could trust him. He couldn't blame her. In her eyes, he was just another suit, another person with more money than empathy. But something in his expression, something that even he didn't fully understand, must have convinced her. Slowly, she rose to her feet, wincing as if the mere act of standing was painful. Without another word, William led her to the car. the weight of an unfamiliar responsibility settling on his shoulders. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he was opening his carefully guarded world to a stranger. But he couldn't walk away. Not this time. As the car pulled away from the curb, William glanced at her again, a question lingering at the back of his mind. Why does she seem so familiar? Neither of them knew that this moment, this random, unexpected encounter, was only the beginning of a truth that would shatter both their lives. The ride back to William's penthouse was steeped in a heavy silence. The girl sat in the corner of the leather seat, her eyes staring out the window, though she seemed to be looking at something far beyond the streets of New York. William watched her from the corner of his eye, wondering what he had just gotten himself into. She hadn't said a word since she stepped into the car, and the more they sat in silence, the more questions buzzed in his mind. She looked too young to be out here on her own, maybe 21 or 22, but life had clearly been harsh to her. Her clothes were worn, her shoes almost falling apart, and there was a weariness in her expression that spoke of years of survival. But there was also something else, a strange familiarity that he couldn't shake. "Do you have a name?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated, then glanced at him briefly before looking away again. "Melanie," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Melanie," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded familiar, too, but he couldn't place why. "And you?" she asked, her voice suddenly stronger, a hint of defiance creeping into it. He almost laughed at the irony. She clearly didn't know who he was. Most people in New York did. William Anderson. There was no flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't care. It was oddly refreshing. They pulled up to his building, a sleek, modern tower of glass and steel that seemed out of place in the grimy streets below. Melanie's eyes widened slightly as she took it in, but she said nothing. William led her inside, the doorman giving him a brief nod, his eyes flicking to Melanie with a trace of curiosity but no questions. Everyone here knew better than to pry into William's business. The elevator ride up was silent again, though William could feel the tension growing between them. He had never been the type to offer help, especially not to strangers. But there was something about this girl that he couldn't ignore, something that tugged at his mind and wouldn't let go. When they reached his penthouse, he opened the door and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. Melanie hesitated at the threshold, glancing around as if she didn't quite believe what was happening. "This is your place?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with disbelief. "It is." He nodded. "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent." She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the luxurious surroundings. The open floor plan, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the modern art on the walls. It was a world apart from where she had been only minutes ago. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she didn't quite belong in a place like this. William walked over to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, handing it to her. "You should eat something. I'll have food brought up." Melanie took the water with a mumbled thanks, but didn't open it. She looked like she didn't know how to react, her eyes darting around, as if waiting for him to change his mind, to tell her to leave. Instead, he gestured to the couch. "Sit. Rest." She blinked at him, confusion clouding her face. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was sharp, edged with suspicion. "You don't even know me." William didn't have a good answer to that. He barely understood it himself. He was a man who made decisions based on logic, on careful calculation, never emotion. But this girl, something about her stirred a memory deep inside him, a part of his past he thought was long buried. "I don't know," he admitted, surprising both of them, "but I couldn't just leave you out there." Melanie narrowed her eyes, trying to read him, trying to figure out what his angle was. She was clearly someone who had learned not to trust easily, and that only made William more curious about her. What had happened to her? How had she ended up on the streets? "And what happens after tonight?" she asked, her voice now softer, almost vulnerable. "Where do I go tomorrow?" William hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. "We'll figure it out," he repeated, though even to his ears, it sounded uncertain. Melanie studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing her options, then finally sat down on the couch, still holding the unopened bottle of water in her lap. She leaned back cautiously, as if afraid she might break something, her body tense. "I don't need charity," she muttered, almost to herself. William's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what to say to that. He wasn't trying to be charitable. He wasn't even sure what he was trying to do. But now that she was here, he felt responsible, in a way he hadn't expected. They sat in silence for a while, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. William's mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling of recognition he'd had when he first saw her. He couldn't shake the idea that he knew her, or at least that she reminded him of someone from his past. But who? Suddenly, Melanie broke the silence. "I don't remember my parents," she said, her voice flat, like she was stating a fact she had come to accept. "I grew up in foster care, bounced around a lot." William turned to her, surprised by the sudden openness. She hadn't shared much up until now, and this felt like a small crack in her guarded exterior. "I've been trying to find out who they were," she continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point outside the window. "But no one seems to know. It's like they disappeared." William felt a strange knot form in his stomach. Her words stirred something inside him, something unsettling. "Do you have anything to go on?" he asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard. Melanie shook her head. "Just bits and pieces. Old papers, some stories from foster homes, nothing solid. I don't even know if they're still alive." A chill ran down William's spine. He couldn't explain it, but the more she spoke, the more that familiar feeling gnawed at him. A memory from years ago, half forgotten, flickered in the back of his mind, just out of reach. "Maybe you're better off not knowing," William said softly, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. The truth, once uncovered, had a way of reshaping everything. Melanie didn't respond. She just sat there, lost in her own thoughts, and William realized he was feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a connection. But with that connection came an unsettling suspicion, one that he wasn't ready to face yet. But deep down, he already knew that Melanie Moore was more than just a lost girl. She was the key to a past he had tried so hard to forget. The night settled into a heavy quiet. Melanie had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up under a blanket William had offered her. She looked peaceful now, her face softened by sleep, but the exhaustion was etched deep into her skin. William watched her from the kitchen, his mind racing as the pieces of an unsolved puzzle clicked and shifted. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something about her that pulled at a part of him he had long since buried. The way her eyes darted around cautiously, the way she held herself like someone who had been on her own for too long. It reminded him of someone he had loved. William poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stood by the window, staring out at the city. His thoughts drifted back to a time he rarely allowed himself to remember. Her name was Rachel Moore, a woman who had once meant everything to him. She had appeared in his life like a storm, unexpected, fierce, and impossible to forget. They were young, reckless, and deeply in love, but life had other plans. Rachel had disappeared from his life nearly 23 years ago, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartbreak. He hadn't spoken her name in over a decade, refusing to dwell on the pain of their separation. But seeing Melanie tonight had triggered something inside him. The resemblance was undeniable, the sharpness of her features, the color of her eyes. It was as if he were staring at Rachel's ghost. Could it be possible? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It was absurd. He had searched for Rachel for years after she left, only to find nothing. She had vanished, as if she never existed. There had been rumors, whispers, but no solid answers. And the child they had lost. He had been told she hadn't survived. That part of his life was over, or so he had thought. But now, the past was clawing its way back, demanding his attention. William took a slow sip of his drink, his mind drifting back to the last time he had seen Rachel. It was a bitter memory, one filled with accusations and pain. They had been too young, too broken by the weight of their circumstances. When she told him she was pregnant, he had promised to take care of her, to build a life for them. But life had other plans. Rachel had disappeared before the baby was born, and all he had been told was that the child hadn't made it. That loss had nearly destroyed him. He hadn't heard from her since. But now, standing in the quiet of his penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much larger than a coincidence. He looked at Melanie, sleeping soundly on the couch. Could she be Rachel's daughter? Could she be his daughter? The thought chilled him. He set the glass down on the counter, running a hand through his hair, trying to think logically, but it was hard when the memories were pressing in so fast. He needed answers, but he couldn't just come out and ask her. Not yet. Not until he was sure. As the night wore on, William found himself unable to sleep. He sat at his desk, pulling up old files, searching through the records he had kept from his days with Rachel. There wasn't much, just a few photographs, some old letters, and a worn hospital report that confirmed the child hadn't survived the birth. He had always trusted that report, but now it felt like a lie, one that had been carefully constructed to keep him in the dark. Morning came, the light breaking through the tall windows as William stared down at the papers spread across his desk. His mind was racing, searching for connections, for any clue that could link Melanie to the past he had tried to forget. But all he had were memories and questions. Around 7 a.m., he heard Melanie stirring in the living room. She padded into the kitchen, looking around nervously, clearly unsure of her place in this foreign, luxurious world. William tried to compose himself, pushing aside the storm in his mind. "Morning," he greeted, his voice even. "Did you sleep all right?" Melanie nodded, though she still seemed hesitant, like she didn't trust the kindness. "Better than I've slept in a long time." William motioned toward the fridge. "Help yourself to anything. There's coffee if you want." She looked at him for a moment, as if trying to figure out why he was being so generous. It was clear she wasn't used to people offering anything without expecting something in return. Slowly, she moved to the fridge, pulling out a carton of juice and pouring herself a glass. William took a breath, steadying himself. He needed to approach this carefully, but he had to know. He couldn't let the question fester any longer. "Melanie," he started, choosing his words with caution, "you said you don't know anything about your parents." She stiffened slightly but nodded. "Yeah, just bits and pieces. I've been searching for a long time, but nothing's ever led anywhere. Do you know anything about where you were born? Any names, places?" Melanie shook her head, looking down at her glass. "No, I was told I was born somewhere in the Midwest, but that's all I know. I don't even have a birth certificate." She looked up at him then, her eyes hardening. "Why? Why do you care?" The question hit him like a punch. How could he explain without revealing too much, too soon? I have some connections. People who might be able to help you find out more." She studied him carefully, clearly trying to figure out what his angle was. William could feel the tension building between them, but he kept his expression neutral. "I don't need your help," she said firmly, setting the glass down on the counter with a sharp clink. "I've been doing fine on my own." William nodded, not wanting to push. "I understand, but the offer stands." Melanie turned away, walking back toward the living room, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. William watched her go, his mind racing. She had no idea how much her past was tied to his own, and if what he suspected was true, the truth could destroy them both. But he couldn't stop now. He needed to know. The question of her identity hung between them, unspoken but heavy, and William knew it was only a matter of time before the past came crashing into the present. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The tension between them lingered for the rest of the morning. Melanie kept her distance, occupying herself with little tasks, cleaning up after breakfast, fixing her tangled hair in the bathroom mirror, anything to avoid conversation. William, too, was careful not to push her, but the unease gnawed at him. The connection he felt to her wasn't something he could simply ignore anymore. By noon, he made up his mind. He needed answers, and there was only one place he could start: Rachel Moore. If Melanie was truly his daughter, there would be a trail to follow, no matter how buried it was. And if she wasn't, well, he still owed it to himself to know for sure. William stepped into his office, pulling the door shut behind him. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. It had been years since he last called Daniel Crawford, an old private investigator he had once hired to track down Rachel after she vanished. Daniel had come up empty back then, but maybe with a fresh lead, a name. He could finally uncover the truth. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "William Anderson. Didn't expect to hear from you again." "Daniel, I need your help. It's personal. Last time it was personal. I spent 6 months chasing a ghost. This about Rachel?" William hesitated. "Yes. It might be more complicated this time. I've got someone staying with me. A young woman. Her name is Melanie Moore." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Moore? You think she's Rachel's?" "I don't know." William exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "But I can't shake the feeling. She looks like her, Daniel. Same eyes, same face. I need to know if she's mine." Daniel was silent for a moment before speaking again. "I'll see what I can dig up. But if this girl's been under the radar all these years, it's gonna take some time." "I understand. I'll wire whatever you need. Give me a few days, and I'll get back to you." William ended the call, his stomach twisting with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He couldn't tell Melanie about this, at least not yet. Not until he had something concrete. But keeping this from her weighed heavily on him, knowing that the truth could either bring them together or tear everything apart. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, there was a knock on his office door. Melanie stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "I need to go," she said, her tone flat. William straightened, caught off guard. "Go? Where?" "Anywhere but here." She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding his. "I can't stay here, William. This isn't me. I don't belong in some fancy penthouse. I'm not one of your charity cases." William opened his mouth to argue, but she cut him off. "I appreciate what you've done for me, really, I do. But I'm not looking for someone to fix my life. I'm used to being on my own." Her voice softened at the end, and for the first time since she arrived, William saw a glimpse of the pain she had been carrying for so long. "Melanie, listen." "No," she interrupted again, her voice rising. "You don't understand. I've spent my whole life trying to figure out where I come from, who I am. And every time I think I'm close, it slips away. I can't keep going like this." William felt the weight of her words, and in that moment, he realized how deeply their stories were intertwined. The same questions that haunted her were the ones that had tormented him for decades. And now, they both stood on the brink of answers neither of them was fully prepared for. "I do understand," he said quietly. "More than you think." Melanie's eyes flickered with surprise, but she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I lost someone a long time ago," William began, choosing his words carefully. "Someone I loved. She left, and I thought our child didn't survive. But now, I'm not so sure." He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. "When I saw you, I couldn't ignore it. You remind me so much of her." Melanie's face paled, her eyes widening. "What are you saying?" "I don't know for sure," William admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think you might be my daughter." The silence that followed was suffocating. Melanie stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, something deeper, more painful. She shook her head slowly, backing away from the door. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, that's not possible." William took a step toward her, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not asking you to believe me. Not yet. But I've hired someone to look into it, to find out the truth. If you'll let me, I want to help you find the answers." Tears welled up in Melanie's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, her jaw clenched. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't need anyone's help." William's chest tightened. He had expected resistance, but the hurt in her voice cut deeper than he anticipated. He knew he had no right to force this on her, no right to demand anything from her. But he also couldn't let her walk out of his life without knowing the truth. "I'm not trying to fix your life, Melanie," he said softly. "I'm trying to understand mine. If there's a chance that you're my daughter, I need to know. For both of us." Melanie stood frozen, her eyes locked on his, as if she were searching for some sign of deceit or manipulation. But all she found was the raw, unfiltered truth in his gaze. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "And if I am?" she asked, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "What then?" William swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, it would change both their lives forever. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we'll figure it out. Together." For the first time since they met, Melanie let her guard down, just for a moment. She wiped a tear from her cheek, nodding slowly, as if she were giving herself permission to hope. But the pain was still there, lurking beneath the surface, and William knew that no matter what the truth revealed, there would be scars that might never fully heal. But for now, they had something they hadn't had before, each other. And as fragile as that was, it was enough to keep them from falling apart. For now, the air between them remained heavy after their conversation. Melanie didn't leave, but the silence in William's penthouse grew more oppressive with each passing minute. She sat by the window, looking out at the city, her thoughts clearly far away. William stayed in his office, staring at the papers scattered across his desk, trying to piece together how they had both ended up here. His mind kept returning to Rachel, the way she had vanished from his life so completely, without a trace. The more he thought about her, the more certain he became that Melanie was somehow connected to that part of his past. But there was a missing piece, something he couldn't grasp. In the afternoon, Daniel Crawford called. "I've got something," the investigator said without preamble. "You're not going to like it." William's heart pounded as he gripped the phone. "Tell me." "There's a birth certificate." Melanie Moore was born 22 years ago in a small hospital outside of Chicago. Mother's name, Rachel Moore. William's breath caught in his throat. He stood from his chair, his pulse racing. "And the father?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not listed." "But William, there's more." Daniel paused, his voice lowering. Rachel didn't just disappear. She was hiding. From someone. William frowned, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. Hiding? From who? "I haven't got all the details yet, but from what I've found, Rachel was involved with some dangerous people after she left you. It looks like she was trying to protect Melanie, maybe even from you." The words hit William like a blow. Protect her from him? He sank into his chair, his mind reeling. Rachel had loved him. At least, that's what he had always believed. How could she think he was a danger to their child? "I'll keep digging," Daniel said, "but be prepared. The truth might not be what you're hoping for." William ended the call, feeling a deep sense of unease. Protecting Melanie from him? It didn't make sense. Why would Rachel think he would hurt their daughter? He stared out at the skyline, the memories of his time with Rachel swirling in his mind. He remembered the early days, their whirlwind romance, the way they had dreamed of building a life together. But he also remembered the arguments, the distance that had started to grow between them. When Rachel had told him she was pregnant, everything had changed. William had been so focused on his career, on making enough money to provide for their future, that he hadn't seen how deeply she was struggling. And then, one day, she was gone. Now, years later, the ghosts of their past were resurfacing, and William was forced to confront the possibility that he had failed Rachel in ways he hadn't realized. He looked up to see Melanie standing in the doorway of his office, her expression guarded. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. William hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. But he couldn't keep lying to her. She deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "I spoke to a private investigator," he said quietly, motioning for her to sit down. "I had him look into your past. And your mother's." Melanie's eyes narrowed. "What did you find?" William swallowed hard. "Your mother, Rachel, was trying to protect you. She was hiding from someone." Melanie's face twisted in confusion. "Hiding? From who?" William shook his head. "I don't know yet, but the fact that she never told you about me, I think she was trying to keep you safe." A heavy silence fell between them, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. Melanie sat down slowly, her hands clenched in her lap. "She never told me anything. I don't even remember her." William's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He had spent years searching for answers, while Melanie had spent her whole life living in the shadow of a mystery she couldn't solve. "I don't know why she left," William said, his voice thick with regret. "But I loved her. And if I had known you were alive, I would have never stopped looking for you." Melanie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "But she didn't want you to find me, did she? She kept me away from you for a reason." William didn't know how to respond. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know what Rachel's reasons were. All he knew was that the woman he had loved had hidden their child from him, and that betrayal cut deep. "I don't know why she did what she did," William admitted, "but I'm not going to let you go again. Not until we figure this out." Melanie looked away, her jaw tight, as if she were trying to hold back tears. "What if I'm not what you want me to be?" she whispered. "What if this is all a mistake?" William's chest tightened. He stood up, walking over to where she sat, and knelt down in front of her. "Melanie, you are not a mistake. You're my daughter, and that means something to me. I don't care about the past. I just want to be part of your future." Melanie's eyes softened, and for the first time since they met, William saw the wall between them start to crack. She was scared. Scared of letting him in, scared of being hurt again. And he understood that fear, because he felt it too. But he wasn't going to let it stop him. Not this time. Just as Melanie opened her mouth to speak, William's phone rang, cutting through the moment like a knife. He stood up, his stomach knotting as he saw Daniel's number on the screen. "I have to take this," he said, his voice tense. Melanie nodded, though her expression had darkened again, the vulnerability she had shown moments earlier quickly retreating. William cursed under his breath as he answered the call, stepping away from her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "I found something," Daniel said, his tone grim. "William, I don't think Rachel was just trying to protect Melanie. I think she was trying to protect both of you." William's blood ran cold. "From who?" "The people Rachel got involved with. They weren't just dangerous. They were tied to some high-level corruption. Corporate espionage, money laundering, you name it. I don't have all the details yet, but if Melanie's their daughter, they might still be looking for her. For you." William's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. Rachel hadn't left him because she wanted to. She had been forced to run, to protect their daughter from people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "I'll send you everything I have," Daniel said. "But be careful, William. You and Melanie might not be safe." William ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He turned to Melanie, who was watching him closely, her eyes full of questions. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. William took a deep breath, knowing that whatever he said next would change everything. "They're still out there," he said slowly. "The people who took your mother from us. And now, they might be coming for you." Melanie froze, her eyes widening as William's words sank in. The gravity of the situation hung thick in the air between them, heavier than anything they had faced before. "Coming for me?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" William swallowed hard, stepping closer to her, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your mother. She was running from people, dangerous people. They were involved in things that could have gotten her killed, things I never knew about. Now that you're back, they might see you as a threat." Melanie shook her head, disbelief etched across her face. "But I don't know anything. I don't even remember her, or who she was running from. Why would they care about me now?" "They don't need a reason," William said softly. "You're her daughter. That's enough for them to see you as a loose end." Melanie's breath quickened, and William could see the fear in her eyes. For years, she had been searching for answers about her past, and now that she was getting them, the truth was more dangerous than either of them had imagined. She turned away from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the overwhelming reality. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "I didn't ask for any of this." William's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He wanted to tell her that it would be okay, that they would get through this, but he wasn't sure how. The weight of the unknown, who was after them, what they wanted. how far they would go, was crushing. "Melanie," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "we'll figure this out. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She let out a bitter laugh, spinning around to face him. "You can't protect me, William. You don't even know who we're up against. For all we know, they could already be watching us. I've spent my whole life looking over my shoulder, and now it's starting all over again." Her words hit him hard, but William refused to back down. "I will protect you," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent years building an empire, dealing with people who would do anything for power and money. I'm not afraid of them." Melanie shook her head again, her expression torn between anger and fear. "You don't get it. You're a businessman, William. These people, they don't play by your rules. They don't care about your money or your connections." She was right, and that was the most terrifying part. For all the power and influence William had accumulated over the years, none of it mattered now. These people had taken Rachel from him, forced her into hiding, and now they were coming for Melanie. His wealth couldn't shield them from that, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. "I know you're scared," he said softly, taking a step toward her. "I am too, but we can't run from this. We need to find out who they are, what they want, and how to stop them." Melanie's eyes flickered with uncertainty, her defenses wavering. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of breaking down, but she quickly pulled herself together, her shoulders straightening as she met his gaze. "And how do we do that?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "How do we even begin to fight something we don't understand?" William thought for a moment, weighing their options. He had connections, people in high places who owed him favors, but this wasn't a battle that could be won with influence alone. They needed information, something concrete to expose the people who were after them. "I'll contact Daniel," he said finally. "He's the best investigator I know. If anyone can dig up more on these people, it's him. And in the meantime, I'll make sure you're safe." Melanie didn't respond right away. She stood there, her expression conflicted, as if she were weighing whether to trust him or keep running. William could see the war playing out in her mind, the instinct to protect herself at all costs, the years of survival that had taught her not to rely on anyone. But after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Okay, I'll stay. For now." Relief flooded through William, though he knew this was only the beginning. They were on borrowed time, and every second they spent in the dark brought them closer to whatever danger was lurking in the shadows. That evening, William called Daniel again, his mind racing as he relayed everything they had learned so far. Daniel listened in silence, occasionally grunting in acknowledgement, before finally speaking. "You're in deep, William," Daniel said grimly. "This isn't just some small-time criminal operation. These people are connected to bigger players, corporations, maybe even government officials. Rachel must have known something dangerous enough to get her killed." William's stomach twisted. "So what do we do?" "I'm digging into her old contacts," Daniel said. "People she might have worked with, or who were close to her before she disappeared. If I find anything, I'll let you know. But in the meantime, keep a low profile. These people don't play by the same rules as you." William hung up the phone, the weight of Daniel's warning pressing down on him. He glanced toward the living room, where Melanie sat on the couch, staring out the window into the darkness. She looked small and fragile in the dim light, and William felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility wash over him. He walked over to her, sitting down beside her on the couch. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "For everything. For not being there when you needed me." Melanie didn't look at him, but she didn't pull away either. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You didn't know." "I should have," William replied, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have done more to find you, to find Rachel. I didn't even know she was in danger." Melanie turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "You couldn't have known. She kept you in the dark, just like she did with me." The weight of those words hung between them. Rachel had kept them both apart, hiding them from a danger that neither of them fully understood. But now, they were no longer in the dark. The truth was beginning to surface, piece by piece. And with it came the threat that had been chasing Rachel for so long. "Whatever happens next," William said, his voice firm, "we're in this together. I won't let anyone hurt you." Melanie nodded, though the fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. She didn't fully trust him yet. How could she? But William could see that she wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a way out of this. For now, that was enough. As the night wore on, the two of them sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker outside the window. The danger was still out there, waiting for them in the shadows, but for the first time, they were facing it together. And that, William realized, made all the difference. The days following their conversation passed in a blur. Every moment felt like a countdown, ticking toward an unknown threat lurking just out of sight. William had spent countless hours on the phone with Daniel, piecing together fragments of information about the people Rachel had been running from, while Melanie remained distant, caught between her need for answers and her fear of what they might find. One afternoon, as William sat in his office reviewing Daniel's latest findings, he heard a soft knock on the door. He glanced up to see Melanie standing there, her expression guarded, but there was something different in her eyes. A vulnerability that she had kept hidden since the day they met. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. William set aside the papers and nodded. "Of course." She hesitated for a moment, as if she were searching for the right words. Finally, she stepped into the room and sat down in the chair opposite him, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "about everything. My mom, my past you. I don't know if I'll ever get the answers I'm looking for, but there's something I need to tell you." William's heart pounded in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Melanie would finally open up to him, and yet the fear in her voice made him uneasy. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Melanie looked down at her hands, as if the words were too heavy to say out loud. "I've spent my whole life thinking that I wasn't wanted," she whispered. "That my mom left me because I wasn't good enough, or because she didn't love me. And now I find out she was running to protect me. But what about you?" She lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes filled with years of hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you find me sooner? Why didn't you try?" William's breath caught in his throat. This was the question he had been dreading, the one that had haunted him for years. He had spent so long believing that Rachel had taken his daughter away, that their child hadn't survived. But now, sitting in front of him was the living proof that his assumptions had been wrong. "I thought you were gone," William said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "After your mother left, I tried to find her, to find you. But when I was told, when they said you didn't survive," he paused, swallowing the lump in his throat, "I believed it. I had no reason not to." Melanie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But you gave up." "No," William shook his head, his voice stronger now. "I never gave up. I searched for years, hired investigators, dug into every lead I could find. But every time I got close, the trail went cold. I didn't stop because I didn't care. I stopped because I thought I'd lost everything." Melanie's expression softened, but the pain was still there, raw and exposed. "And now you know I'm alive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what if I'm not who you thought I'd be? What if I'm just broken?" William's chest tightened. He stood up, crossing the room to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Melanie, you are not broken. You've been through things no one should have to face, and you're still standing. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you strong." Tears spilled down Melanie's cheeks, and she looked away, her defenses crumbling. "I don't feel strong," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I feel lost. I've spent my whole life running from who I am, and now I don't even know where to start." William's heart ached for her. He understood that feeling of being lost, of searching for something that always seemed just out of reach. He had spent years building his empire, trying to fill the void that Rachel and his child had left behind, but none of it had given him the peace he craved. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "We'll figure it out. Together." Melanie looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and a flicker of hope. "Do you really mean that? Or are you just saying it because you feel guilty?" William's breath caught at the raw honesty in her question, but he didn't hesitate. I'm saying it because it's the truth. I can't change the past, Melanie, but I can promise you this. I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Melanie wiped her eyes, nodding slowly, as if she were allowing herself to believe him for the first time. I don't know how to trust you, she admitted softly. I want to, but I've been on my own for so long, it's hard. William's heart broke at the admission. He knew trust wasn't something that could be forced. It had to be earned, and he was willing to do whatever it took to earn Melanie's. I'm not asking you to trust me overnight, he said gently, but I'm here for as long as it takes. Melanie nodded again, her lips trembling as she tried to hold back more tears. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible, for not giving up on me. William stood, pulling her up with him, and wrapped her in a gentle hug. For the first time, she didn't pull away. She leaned into him, allowing herself to be held, to let go of the weight she had carried for so long. It wasn't the resolution to everything. They still had so many questions, so many dangers lurking ahead. But in that moment, something shifted between them. Melanie had spent years searching for answers about who she was, and now, with William by her side, she was beginning to find them. Later that night, William received another call from Daniel. This time, the tone in his voice was different, urgent. I've got something concrete, Daniel said without preamble. But it's bad, William. Worse than we thought. William's pulse quickened. What is it? The people Rachel was hiding from, they're not just after Melanie, they're after you. William's hand tightened around the phone, a knot forming in his stomach. Me? Why? There's evidence Rachel uncovered something connected to one of your business ventures, something illegal. Corporate sabotage, insider trading. I'm still putting the pieces together. But whoever's behind it, they think you know what she found. And now they're coming for you both. William's blood ran cold. Everything was falling into place. The threats, the danger, Rachel's disappearance. She hadn't just been protecting Melanie. She had been protecting him too, from a conspiracy that reached far deeper than he had realized. How much time do we have? William asked, his voice tense. Not long. They've been watching you. They know about Melanie. I don't know what their next move will be, but you need to get ahead of this. William hung up the phone, his mind racing. He turned to Melanie, who was standing nearby, her eyes full of questions. What's going on? She asked, sensing the shift in his demeanor. William took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next, they had to face it together. It's worse than we thought, he said, his voice low. And we're running out of time. Melanie's eyes widened in fear, but William's resolve hardened. They had come too far to turn back now. Together, they would face the truth, and whatever danger came with it. The tension in the room was palpable. William's mind raced with the implications of Daniel's call. The idea that his company had been infiltrated by criminals, using it as a cover for international corruption, made his blood run cold. But the thought of Rachel being killed for uncovering the truth, it was almost too much to bear. Across the room, Melanie sat on the edge of a chair, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She could sense that whatever William had just learned had changed everything, but she didn't know how deeply it ran. What did Daniel say? She asked again, her voice more insistent this time, her fear seeping into her words. William sighed, trying to keep his voice steady. He had to protect her, but he also couldn't shield her from the reality of what they were up against. It's worse than we thought, he began slowly, sitting across from her. The people who are after us, they're part of something much bigger than just a criminal gang. It's a global network, using companies like mine to funnel money through illegal deals, bribery, and more. Rachel, she found out about it. Melanie blinked, her face going pale. She knew, and they killed her for it? William nodded, the guilt settling like a heavy stone in his chest. She was protecting you, protecting both of us. They're after me now because they think I know what she found, but I don't. The air grew thick with silence as Melanie processed this new layer of truth. William could see the turmoil brewing behind her eyes, anger, fear, and a profound sense of betrayal. He knew how hard this must be for her, To have finally uncovered the truth about her mother's death only to realize that her own life was in danger because of it. "I don't understand," Melanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she tell you?" William shook his head, feeling the weight of his own regrets. Rachel was scared. She was always trying to protect the people she loved, and I think she believed the only way to do that was to keep us in the dark. If I had known what she was up against, maybe I could have helped her. The words hung between them like a dark cloud, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Melanie's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We find out exactly what they want, who they are," William replied firmly. "Daniel's looking into it, but we have to assume that they're watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake." Melanie's eyes flicked up to meet his, fear mingled with defiance. "And if they find us first?" William stood, walking over to the window, staring out at the vast property surrounding the estate. The trees, the high fences, the security cameras, it all felt like a flimsy shield against the unknown forces that were closing in on them. He had built this life to be untouchable, but now, everything felt fragile. "They won't," he said finally, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We'll stay here until we know more. Daniel's sending over files, everything he's uncovered about the network. We'll use that information to get ahead of them." Melanie nodded, though the worry on her face didn't fade. She stood and crossed the room, stopping beside him at the window. The view outside was peaceful, but the storm brewing inside both of them was far from calm. "I never thought this was how it would end," she said softly, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I spent my whole life searching for my mother, for answers about who I am, and now that I've found them, I feel more lost than ever." William turned to her, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not lost, Melanie. You've just found the truth. And now, we have to decide what to do with it." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What if we can't stop them? What if they come after us, no matter what we do?" William took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Then we fight back. We expose them. We take away their power, the way they've tried to take away ours." Melanie studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I want to help. I want to fight." William felt a surge of pride and fear at the same time. Melanie was stronger than he had ever realized, but the danger they were facing was unlike anything either of them had encountered. Still, they had no choice. They were in this together now, and they would either face their enemies head-on or fall apart. Later that evening, the files Daniel had promised arrived. William sat at the large oak desk in the study, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across the room. Melanie sat beside him, her expression tense as they began to sift through the pages of reports, financial statements, and coded messages that Daniel had uncovered. It didn't take long for the gravity of the situation to become clear. The network was massive, spanning multiple countries, with ties to corrupt officials, arms dealers, and illegal trade operations. And hidden deep within the financial transactions of one of William's subsidiaries was a trail that led back to Rachel. "She must have stumbled across this," William muttered, flipping through the pages. These transactions, they were too small to notice on a regular audit, but she would have seen them. Melanie leaned over, pointing to one of the names listed on the document. "This name keeps coming up. Do you recognize it?" William's eyes narrowed as he studied the name. Jonathan Price. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't immediately place it. "I've heard it before, but I don't know where." Melanie frowned. Could he be the one behind this? William's jaw clenched. Possibly, but we need more than a name. We need to find out who he's working with, what he wants. As they continued to comb through the documents, one thing became increasingly clear. Rachel had been much closer to unraveling the network's secrets than anyone had realized. And now, the same people who had silenced her were coming after them. William glanced at Melanie, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had spent years building his empire, believing that he had control over his life, over his future. But now, everything was at risk. His company, his legacy, and the daughter he had only just found. But he wasn't going to let it slip away. Not now. Not ever. We have to expose them, William said, his voice firm with resolve. We need to take this to the authorities, to the press, anyone who will listen. If we don't, they'll keep coming. Melanie nodded, her eyes filled with a steely determination. Then let's do it. Let's finish what my mom started. As they continued their work, the clock ticking in the background, William felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and racing against time. But they weren't powerless. They had the truth. And sometimes, that was enough to bring an empire to its knees. The night settled thick and heavy over the estate, the silence outside pierced only by the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. Inside, William and Melanie moved through the house, their every step laced with tension, as if they were waiting for something inevitable. The knowledge that their enemies were closing in weighed heavily on both of them. The files had been sent to Claire Donovan. By now, the journalist would be preparing the story for release, but they both knew that meant they had little time left. Once the story hit the press, the people behind the corruption would move swiftly, and if Daniel's warnings were correct, they wouldn't hesitate to silence William and Melanie to protect their secrets. As they sat in the living room, the atmosphere was charged. Marcus, the trusted bodyguard, stood near the windows, his eyes scanning the security feeds. Every flicker on the screen, every shadow outside, felt like a threat waiting to materialize. "They'll come before the story breaks," William said quietly, his gaze focused on the floor. "They'll want to stop us before we have a chance to ruin them." Melanie nodded, her face pale but determined. "We can't run, can we?" William looked at her, his heart heavy with the realization of what had to happen. "No, we fight. Here. Tonight." The words hung in the air, a declaration that neither of them wanted to make but knew was inevitable. They had uncovered too much. Rachel had died trying to protect Melanie from this same network, and now they were walking the same dangerous line. The only difference was that they had each other, and they had the truth. As the minutes ticked by, the estate grew quieter, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Marcus moved through the house, double-checking the security systems, but even he knew that if their enemies wanted to get in, they would find a way. William sat across from Melanie, watching her closely. Despite the fear in her eyes, she had grown stronger in the past few days. The scared young woman he had found on the streets had become someone determined, someone willing to face the darkest parts of her past to fight for her future. "I'm sorry," William said softly, breaking the silence. Melanie looked at him, confusion flickering across her face. "For what?" "For everything," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For not being there for you. For not finding you sooner. For not knowing the truth about what happened to your mother." Melanie's eyes softened, and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "It's not your fault. You didn't know. None of us did." William nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. He had spent so many years building his empire, thinking that wealth and power could protect the people he loved. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. The world he had built was crumbling, and the only thing that mattered was the daughter sitting in front of him. "We're going to make it through this," Melanie said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to." William squeezed her hand, wanting to believe her words. But even as he tried to hold on to hope, a part of him knew that they were standing on the edge of something they might not survive. Suddenly, Marcus's voice cut through the silence. "We've got movement." William and Melanie stood immediately, their hearts racing. Marcus pointed to one of the security feeds, where several figures were moving in the shadows just beyond the tree line. The moment they had been dreading had arrived. "They're here," Marcus said, his voice grim. William's mind raced. There was no more time to prepare, no more time to strategize. The people who had killed Rachel were here, and they were coming for him and Melanie. "We stick to the plan," William said, his voice calm but firm. "You and I stay together. Marcus will cover us." Melanie nodded, though the fear was evident in her eyes. William could see her hands shaking slightly, but she stood tall, refusing to back down. This was the moment everything had been leading to, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. The first gunshot shattered the quiet of the night, echoing through the estate like a thunderclap, Marcus reacted immediately, pulling Melanie behind a heavy piece of furniture as William crouched beside her. The windows on the far side of the house exploded in a shower of glass, and William could hear footsteps approaching from outside. "They're coming from the north side," Marcus yelled, moving toward the front entrance to intercept the intruders. William's heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the handgun Marcus had given him earlier, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Melanie crouched beside him, her face pale but determined. "We'll be fine," William said, his voice low but firm. "Stay close to me." Melanie nodded, gripping his arm tightly. The fear in her eyes was mirrored by the determination to survive. They had come too far to let it end like this. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and two men in dark clothing stormed inside, their weapons raised. William didn't hesitate. He fired, hitting the first man in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Marcus took out the second with precision, his training evident in the way he moved. But more were coming. William could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the house as more men moved in, their intentions clear. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to kill. "We need to move," Marcus yelled, motioning for William and Melanie to follow him toward the back of the house. As they moved, William felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. He had never been in a situation like this before, but now, with everything on the line, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about survival, it was about fighting back. They reached the back of the house, where Marcus had set up a secure exit route. But just as they were about to escape, another gunshot rang out, and William felt a sharp pain in his side. He stumbled, gripping his abdomen, his vision blurring for a moment. "Dad!" Melanie screamed, rushing to his side. William gritted his teeth, fighting through the pain. "I'm fine," he said, though the blood seeping through his shirt told a different story. Marcus pulled them both toward the exit, covering them as they made their way outside. The night air was cold, and the darkness seemed to press in around them. William's vision swam, but he kept moving, knowing that they couldn't stop now. As they reached the edge of the property, headlights appeared in the distance. For a moment, William feared it was more of their enemies, but then he recognized the car. It was Claire Donovan, arriving just in time. She stepped out, her face filled with concern as she saw the blood on William's shirt. "Get in," she yelled, opening the car door. With Marcus's help, William and Melanie climbed into the car, the weight of everything that had happened settling over them like a suffocating blanket. As Claire sped away from the estate, Melanie held William's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. William nodded, though the pain in his side was growing worse. He could feel himself slipping, but he held on to the one thing that mattered. His daughter was safe. "We did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We stopped them." Melanie sobbed, holding his hand tighter. "Stay with me, Dad. Please." As the car sped through the night, the world around them faded, but William felt a strange sense of peace. He had fought for his family, for the truth, and for the legacy that would live on through Melanie. And that, he realized, was enough.